I've heard people say that the saddest sound in the world isn't crying, it's silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settles around someone who's been waiting too long for footsteps that never come. If you believe every child deserves to be seen, to be celebrated, to feel like they belong, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you will make you want to change how the world treats its forgotten children. The first time I saw Lila, she was sitting at the very edge of a corner booth in Margie's bakery, as far from the morning crowd as possible, like she'd learned to make herself small in public. The smell of fresh cinnamon rolls and warm coffee filled the air, and the sunlight pouring through the big front window turned the dust motes into gold. But none of that seemed to touch her. She was maybe 8 years old, with a halo of brown curls pinned back messily, wearing a faded lavender dress that hung loose on her frame. Her legs, thin and still, were strapped into the black metal of a wheelchair that looked far too big for her. In front of her sat a single cupcake on a chipped white plate, vanilla with pink frosting, one tiny candle sticking out of the middle, still unlit. The rest of the tables were alive with chatter, mothers corralling toddlers, friends meeting over coffee, someone laughing too loud at a joke. But Lila's table was an island, untouched and unnoticed. I caught myself wondering if she'd chosen that spot for the privacy, or if she'd been placed there to keep her out of the way. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, fingertips fidgeting against each other, like she was rehearsing some invisible script in her head. Every now and then she'd glance toward the door, her expression flickering with a quick, almost imperceptible hope, before it dimmed again when no one familiar walked in. Outside, a January wind rattled the glass, and I could see from her posture that she'd been here a while. The candle hadn't been lit yet, and something about that tiny detail felt heavier than it should have. It was a birthday tradition paused indefinitely, waiting for someone else to show up and make it mean something. Her eyes wandered to the counter, where Margie herself was chatting with two regulars, but no one seemed to notice that the girl was alone. No parent, no friend, no sibling sitting across from her with a wrapped gift. Just a lonely cupcake on a table too big for one. I knew enough about small-town whispers to guess at her story without anyone saying a word. Lila was that girl. The one whose parents weren't in the picture, who'd bounced between foster homes and special care since the accident that took her ability to walk. People didn't mean to ignore her, but they did. The way you ignore something that reminds you life isn't fair. Some said her mother had run off when she was a baby. Others claimed her father had died in a car crash. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle, but either way, she'd been alone long before this birthday. Her gaze dropped to the cupcake, and she leaned forward slightly, studying it as if deciding whether to blow out the candle without the formality of anyone singing. For a moment, her lips pressed together in a way that told me she'd already learned the art of pretending not to care. That was when the door chimed, and the gust of cold air brought in a man and a little girl who would change the course of that morning, though neither of them knew it yet. They didn't notice her right away. The man was tall, shoulders broad under a worn brown jacket, his jeans faded at the knees. His daughter, no more than 4, had her mittened hand wrapped tightly around his, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she trotted beside him. They headed to the counter, laughing over something I couldn't hear, and the girl pointed eagerly at the display of sugar cookies shaped like snowflakes. The man crouched down to her level, listening intently, the way you only do when the person talking is the center of your world. It would have been easy for them to get their treats and leave, just another father-daughter stop in the weekend routine. But when the man straightened and scanned the room for a table, his eyes landed on Lila. I saw the moment he paused, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, from casual scanning to the kind of focus that meant something had reached past the noise and tapped him on the shoulder. His gaze lingered on her untouched cupcake, the unlit candle, the empty chairs around her. Lila must have sensed it too, because she looked up at him then, quick and uncertain, like a stray cat unsure if the offered hand meant kindness or harm. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But in that single glance, something unspoken passed between them, something that made him take a small step in her direction before stopping himself, as if unsure whether he was intruding. The little girl tugged at his sleeve, holding up her cookie triumphantly, but he was still watching Lila. His expression wasn't pity, not exactly. It was recognition. The kind you only get when you've been the lonely one before, the one pretending not to mind. He said something to his daughter, who turned to look at Lila with wide, curious eyes. Then, without another word, he started toward her table, weaving between chairs until he was standing in front of her. Up close, his voice was warm, gentle, but with that underlying firmness that told you he was used to making hard calls. "Hey," he said, crouching slightly, so he wasn't towering over her. "Is it your birthday?" She blinked, hesitant, then gave the smallest of nods. "That's a nice cupcake," he said, glancing at the plate. "But I think birthdays are better when you've got company. Mind if we join you?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment I thought she might refuse. Kids like Lila didn't trust easily. But then her eyes flicked to his daughter, who was already climbing into the chair across from her, swinging her legs and grinning like they'd been friends for years, and something in Lila's posture softened. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. The man smiled, sat down beside his daughter, and reached for the matches on the table. As he struck one and touched the flame to the candle's wick, the tiny fire bloomed between them, warm and steady. And for the first time that morning, Lila's face lit up too. The candlelight danced in the draft from the bakery's heater, and for a heartbeat, all three of them just stared at it, like it was some small, fragile sun that might go out if they breathed too hard. The man leaned back slightly, his match extinguished, and smiled at Lila. "You know the rule," he said in a tone that was more gentle invitation than command. "You have to make a wish before you blow it out." Lila's fingers tightened around the edge of her plate. No one had told her to make a wish in years. Not since before the accident, before the revolving door of foster homes where birthdays were just another day on the calendar. She darted a glance toward the door again, but still, no one familiar came through it. The weight of that truth made her throat feel tight. She didn't know if she believed in wishes anymore. But the man's daughter, Emma, she'd said earlier, was already leaning forward, eyes wide and eager, waiting. Lila drew in a slow breath and closed her eyes. Somewhere deep in her chest, the smallest flicker of hope pushed through. She exhaled, sending the flame into a curl of smoke that drifted upward and disappeared. "Good one?" the man asked quietly, as though it might break the magic if he spoke too loud. She opened her eyes and nodded, her lips twitching in the direction of a smile. Emma clapped like she'd just witnessed the grand finale of a fireworks show. "Happy birthday," she chirped, her voice ringing through the bakery. Several customers glanced over, a few smiling faintly before going back to their coffee. But to Lila, it felt like the first time in a long while anyone had said those words and meant them. The man slid a fork toward her and another toward Emma. "We didn't bring presents," he said, his voice apologetic but still warm. "But we're very good at helping people eat cake." Lila hesitated, then nudged the plate toward the center. "We can share," she said, her voice small but certain. They ate in comfortable, slightly messy silence, frosting smudged on Emma's chin and crumbs gathering on the table. Between bites, Emma launched into stories about her preschool, how she'd been the line leader twice in 1 week, how her class hamster had escaped, how she was going to be a doctor for animals and people. Lila listened intently, her eyes following every movement, like Emma's energy was a kind of sunlight she hadn't felt in years. The man let them talk, only interjecting now and then with a patient, "Is that so?" or tell her about the time, like he'd learned that children flourished when you let them take the stage. When Lila asked about Emma's mother, the air shifted almost imperceptibly. The man's gaze softened, his fingers drumming once on the table before he answered. "She's not with us anymore, but we talk about her a lot. Keeps her close." Lila didn't push. She knew what it meant to lose people, to carry them only in stories and photographs. Instead, she said quietly, "Me too," and went back to her cake. By the time the plate was empty, a flush of warmth had crept into Lila's cheeks, not from the sugar, but from the sense, however brief, that she wasn't invisible. The man glanced at his watch, then at her. "We were headed to the park before it gets too cold. You want to come? Emma says she's got a game she can teach you." It wasn't the kind of question you answered lightly. Invitations like that didn't come often in her world, and when they did, there was always the risk they wouldn't be offered again. She bit her lip, her heart thudding harder than it should for something so small. She stopped, glancing toward the counter where Margie was wiping her hands on a towel. The older woman caught her eye and gave a small nod, like permission. Lila turned back. "Okay." Emma squealed in delight, bouncing in her seat. The man smiled. a smile that was equal parts relief and quiet satisfaction, and stood, moving behind Lila's chair without hesitation. All right then, let's go make this the best birthday you've had in a while. As he pushed her toward the door, the chime rang again, letting in a rush of cold air. And for the first time all day, Lila didn't shiver. The park was nearly empty, the winter air crisp enough to make their breath visible. Emma ran ahead, her boots crunching over frost, calling back instructions for a game she seemed to be making up as she went. The man, Jake, Lila had learned, steered her chair along the winding path, matching his pace to hers like he'd been doing it for years. At first, Lila kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, unsure if this was just another fleeting kindness that would vanish as quickly as it came. But when Emma doubled back to take her hand and drag her toward the swings, Jake didn't hurry them along or check his watch. He simply waited, smiling, as if this, right here, was the only thing he needed to do today. They played until the sun dipped low, painting the park in amber light. Emma's laughter carried across the cold air, and to Lila, it felt like being wrapped in something warm and solid. When it was time to leave, Jake crouched beside her chair, looking her straight in the eyes. "You shouldn't have to spend your birthday alone," he said simply. "If it's all right with you, maybe we could make this a tradition. Me, Emma, and you. What do you think?" Lila didn't answer right away. Her throat ached in that way it does when you've been holding back tears for too long. But she managed a small nod, and the smile that broke across Jake's face told her he understood just how much it meant. As they walked back toward the street, Emma skipping between them, her mittened hands holding tightly to each of theirs, Lila realized her wish from that morning wasn't so impossible after all. Sometimes, the family you need doesn't come from where you expect. Sometimes, it walks right through a bakery door, looks you in the eye, and says, "Can we join you?" And just like that, you're not alone anymore.